Let's talk about using classes in tkinter. And what we are going to make is going to look something like this. This is the same layout we have seen in the last part, except now we are using classes to organize all of this, which is making the entire app significantly more manageable. Let's talk about it and then we can implement all of this. The most important thing that you have to understand is that we are basically always taking some kind of widget, usually a frame, but it doesn't have to be. And then we're adding widgets to this frame. And then in the end, we are placing this frame somewhere on the window. That way, we can organize lots of widgets very, very easily. If you understand basic tkinter, this shouldn't be too difficult to implement. Although to make all of this work, let me show you my setup. Here I have two Python files open. On the left side, we have classes.py. This is what I'm going to work in. On the right side, we have the previous code from the last video. This is the same layout or the same app, except that we are not using any classes. So what we are going to do in this video is convert all of this into a class-based approach. That way I can switch between the two and illustrate what's going on. Now, first of all, we have to import the basics. This I can just copy straight away. I want to import tkinter as tk, and I also want to have ttk. Now that we have that, I want to create a class. I'm going to call this app, but you can name this whatever you want. This app is going to become the window. Essentially, this bit here is what we have to turn into a class. The really important thing here that might be a little bit complicated is that this app is going to inherit from tk.tk, which means that the app here is going to be the main window. Let me implement it straight away. This app is supposed to inherit from tk.tk. In the function-based approach, this one here, we have stored this object inside of the window variable. In the class-based approach, we are storing the object itself. Once we have that, I want to call a dunder init method. For now, this one just needs self and nothing else. In here, there's one really important thing that we have to do before anything else, and that is to call super and dunder init. This ensures that this tk functionality works properly. Although, besides that, we don't have to add any arguments, so this one can stay as it is. With these lines of code, we basically have replicated this one line of code here. So far, we have just become less efficient. But what we can do now is get self and, for example, set the title. The title could be something like class-based app. This would be the equivalent of this line here. Let me expand it a tiny bit, like so. In the function-based approach, we got the object, which we called window, and then we called the title method on it. This we can simplify here a tiny bit, because the object itself is, well, self, and we can still call the method on it, because we inherited the entire object, and this is one method of it. To illustrate how all of this is going to work, let me go all the way down in the functional approach and run window.mainLoop. In the class-based approach, this would be self.mainLoop, without any arguments. With that approach, we can simply create an instance of this object and run it. And if I execute the entire code now, we can see we have a window that also has the same title, class-based approach. There you can see it better. Although right now our app is one class. That is a lot easier to manage. Not for now, but it is going to be much easier. So besides that, I want to also duplicate these two bits here, which means inside of window, I want to get self and I want to set the geometry of this class or this app. To duplicate this, I want to have the same dimension, 600 by 600. I can run this again, and there we go. We have a larger window. The same I can do if I duplicate this line. I can set the minimum size here. For this one, we just want two numbers with 600 and 600. That way, if I run this again, I cannot make the app smaller than 600 by 600. And with that, we have copied all of this here to set up our window. Although I do want to make some minor changes, and that is I want to set the title and the geometry from the arguments that we pass into the class when we create the instance of it. Which means inside of app, I want to pass in a title. Let me call it a class-based app. And then I want to add a tuple with the width and the height, which in my case is 600 by 600. Which means I have to update all of this a tiny bit to account for these arguments here, which I think could be a fairly good exercise for you. Try to update the code to account for these arguments. Pause the video now and see if you can figure this one out. First of all, we have to add 2 more parameters to init. I want to have a title and I want to have, let's call it size. The title is very easy to change because this one is just a string, which means inside of title, I can pass in the title. The geometry is going to be a tiny bit more difficult, although not very much. We basically have to figure out how to turn this tuple into a string. In my case, I am using an f string, which means I want to add an f in here. And the first argument is going to be size and 0. The second one is then going to be size and 1. And now we should be good to go. I guess one more thing that we could be doing is right now, minimum size is static. We can also update this one, although we would use the same numbers we have used with geometry. So size 0 and size 1. Which means if I run this now, we cannot see any difference. Although what I can do is change these numbers, let's say to 200 and 400, and now we get a different kind of window. Although I don't actually want to do that. And I think with that, you can already see some advantages. With just one line of code, we can call the entire window and pass arguments into it. So when we actually use the app, this one is much easier to understand than these 4 lines here. And this is only going to become more advanced. For the next bit, I want to work on the menu. Let me show this again. Here is the app. What I want to work on is the left side, this bit here. In the original code, if I move this to the side, we have a menu. The menu is all of this bit here. A couple of widgets, all of those are inside of a menu frame. This menu frame here. Or rather, we are creating it here, we are placing it here, and then we are adding widgets here. On top of that, further down there, we are adding the layout of the widgets further down here, which, all things combined, is really annoying to manage. We basically have a huge amount of code that is really disorganized. This I can change very easily by creating another class that I want to call menu. This menu is going to inherit from ttk and frame. Basically, what we are going to start with is we are going to recreate this frame here. Except now we are not storing ttk frame inside of a variable. Instead, we are creating a whole new object. Inside of this, like with the app, we have to create a dunder init method. This one is going to need self, and on top of that, we are also going to need a parent or a master. Because inside of the init method, I want to call the super dunder init method, and this one is going to need one argument, and that is the master or the parent. The way you have to understand this is that this init method is basically the same as calling the object by itself. And for that, we always have to pass in the master, which in this case is going to be the window. With that, we have basically created another frame. This we can now use inside of the app. The way this is going to work, let me add a couple of comments here. I want to create widgets, and besides that, I have the main setup. All the way at the bottom, I am running the app. The widgets, right now, we only have self.menu, which is going to be the menu. Although, don't forget, when we are calling this menu here, we have to pass in the parent. And this could be an interesting exercise for you. Try to figure out what the parent is. The parent in this instance is self, because the app is tk.tk, what we called window in the functional approach. And in the functional approach, we sort all of this inside of the window variable and pass this inside of the frame. In the class-based approach, let me move this a bit to the side, app itself is the window, So this app we are passing into the menu. That way, this menu is going to have this app as the master. Although if I run all of this, we can't really see very much. There are two reasons for it. Number one, this menu right now is just a frame, and frames are invisible. Although even if they were visible, we couldn't see them because we're not placing this frame anywhere on the app. Right now, there's a parent or a master, but we don't actually position the frame inside of the parent. Which means there are two things we have to work on. Number one, I want to create a label that actually illustrates where the menu is. For that, I simply want to create a ttk and label, like so. The parent here, once again, has to be self. I don't actually want to have text in there. Instead, what I want is a background. This one can be red right now. Right after creating this label, I want to use the pack method, and in here, I want to set expand to true and fill to both. That way, this label is going to fill the entire frame with a red color. And let me move this a bit further to the right so we can see the entire thing. Right, with that, we should be having a menu that's at least visible. Although if I run this again, we still can't see anything because we have to place the frame itself. And this can happen inside of this class as well. Because all we have to do is get self, and now we can run, for example, pack, or we could run grid. We could run whatever we want. To keep it simple for now, I want to run the pack method. If I run this now, we can see all the way in the top, we have a tiny red bar. This we can set to expand being true, and we can set fill to both. And now if I run this frame is covering the entire window. Although in the original, if I expand this a tiny bit more, when we are placing the menu frame, this happens here, we are using the place method with all of these arguments. Meaning I can just copy them, move this a bit further to the side again, and now instead of pack, call the place method. This one has x being 0 and y being 0, so menu is always on the left side. It covers 30% of the width of the window, and it covers the entire height. I can run this again, and there we go. Now we have the same position for the menu. Why this approach is really useful is I can now minimize the menu, and inside of the app, this is what I'm actually working with. The entire menu is simply one entry. I don't have to worry about all of these different snippets that are in different places. The entire menu is in one spot, which makes it much easier to work with. Although right now the menu doesn't have any content, so we have to work a bit more on this. And let me move this a bit further to the right. There we go. Inside of the menu, I want to create all of these menu widgets. These ones here. For that, I'm going to create a separate method. I'm going to call this one define create widgets. This one needs self and nothing else. And in here, I want to create all of these widgets, so let me copy them. We have menu button 1, 2, and 3. We have 2 sliders. We have a toggle frame. This one is a frame in itself. And this one has 2 children, menu toggle 1 and 2. And finally, we have a frame. All of these I want to copy and paste them in here, and also fix the indentations. There's one more change that we do have to make, and that is that all of these buttons and sliders don't have a menu frame as the parent. Instead, I want to change all of the menu frame to self, because all of these buttons should have this menu frame as the parent, with the exception of menu toggle 1 and menu toggle 2, because those two are supposed to be a child of the toggle frame, meaning those we don't actually have to change. Besides that, the entry I forgot to change, this isn't menu frame, this should be self. With that, all I have to do is call this method self.createWidgets, and now I can run this and we can't see anything. Again, this happens because we're only creating widgets, we're not placing them on this frame. For that, I want to create another method. I guess we can call this one create layout. No custom parameters again, and what I want to do now is replicate basically this here. including this one as well. As you can see in here, we are using the grid method to place all of these elements, which means, first of all, what we have to do a bit further up, we have to create the grid for the menu. This I have done here with these 2 lines of code. So let me start by copying those 2. And once again, I have to fix the indentation and move this thing a bit further to the side so we can see what's going on. I want to, first of all, create the grid. For this, I can minimize the create widgets method. I want to get this frame here, and I want to set columns and rows on this, which means instead of the menu frame, I want to get self, although the rest can stay identical. Which means next up, I can place the widgets. For this, once again, I can copy all the stuff I have done here, all of this. And I can place it in here. Once again, we have to fix some indentations, like so. And now we can work with this. And now we have a tiny problem. All of these widgets are only available inside of create widgets. They are in the local scope of this method, inside of here. Which means I couldn't access them inside of this create layout method. I guess there are 2 ways you could approach this problem. Number 1, you could change all of these variables to attributes. So for example, you would turn this variable into an attribute using self, and then down here, you would use self.entry.place. That would be one approach. Although in my case, I don't want to go with that one, so let me undo everything. Instead, I'm going to be a tiny bit lazy here, copy all of this, and then place it inside of create widgets. That way, we are doing all of this inside of one method, and we are staying within the same scope. Not the cleanest approach, and if you had a more complex app, this would probably be something you want to work on more, but for this simple app, this is totally fine. At the very least, let me add some comments here. I want to create the widgets, then I want to create a grid, and then I want to place the widgets. And with that, I want to get rid of this TTK label here, because we don't need it anymore. Now I can run the entire thing, and there we go. We have the entire menu. Still works just as before, except now all of this is inside of one class. And this finishes the menu, which means now I can minimize this. And now we can see menu is simply one entry. That is much easier to work with. And if we wanted to work with it, we can simply open this and then change all of this and do whatever change we want to make, which makes maintaining all of this much easier. So in comparison, here's the original. We had just code for the menu here, 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 here. And this was very difficult to separate from the main widget, for example. So with that, we are making some good progress. Next up, I want to create main. If I run this again, main is this main area here. This one is actually really simple, because what we want to do again is we have main.frame here, just another frame. This one we are putting on the window using the place method again. So this we can start on right away. I want to create another class, and this one I called main. Once again, this has to inherit from ttk.frame. And let me move this a tiny bit further to the side. In here, like for the menu, we are going to need a dunder init method that gets self and it gets a parent. Spelled correctly as well, like so. And don't forget, super underscore underscore init and pass in the parent in here. This is the same thing we have done for the menu. So if I open the init method of the menu, we had all of this. Next up, to actually see the main menu, I want to run the place method again. Although I can copy this from the original video, we are calling this place method here. Which means inside of the init method of main, I want to call self and place, and then place the widget in this position. To make sure that we can see this, I want to once again create ttk label with self as the parent, with background being red, and with the pack method setting expand to true and fill to both. With that, I can simply create this main method inside of the app, right below the menu, self, let's call it main, is going to be main, with self as the parent, and if I run this now, we can see the main frame. Let me minimize the menu and get rid of ttk label here. We definitely know this is going to work. Which means with that, let me show the app again, we can start working on the actual entries, these things here. This one, once again, is going to be one frame. Inside of the frame, we have one label with a background, and then we have a button below. For that, I want to add a tiny bit more code inside of main. I first of all want to create a frame. So I can just call it frame, and this is going to be ttk and frame. The parent here is going to be self. Inside of this frame, I want to have a label and a button. So let me create a label variable. Then I want to use ttk and label. With the frame being the parent, text is going to be, let's say, test1, and the background color is going to be red. After that, I want to create a button, and this is going to be ttk and button. With the frame as the parent, text is going to be, I call this one test1 as well, although let's call it button. That probably makes a bit more sense. These two buttons we now have to get inside of the frame, and this frame we have to place inside of the main frame. Let's start with putting these two widgets inside of the frame. For that, I'm going to use the pack method. So label.pack, expand should be true, and fill should be both. This I can now duplicate because the button is going to work in the same way, with the only difference that the button has padding Y being 10 pixels. Finally, I want to get the frame and pack this one as well. Although for this one, I want to set the side to left. Actually, I can copy all of this from the original. In here, we are placing all of this. If I find it really quick, we are placing the main layout here. We have entry frame 1 and entry frame 2. All of this I want to copy like so. So let me move all of this to the side again, and I want to use this pack method with all of these arguments. And with that, this should be working. Let's try now, and there we go. We can see the entry inside of the main frame. We are making a lot of progress. Now, this is starting to become a tiny bit messy, because this frame here could be its very own class. And this, incidentally, is going to become your exercise. I want you guys to get this frame here and turn it into a separate class, along with all of its children. So it should be a frame class with a label and a button. On top of that, I want you guys to set the color, the label, and the button via the arguments, which means you should be able to use the init method of this new class to set the text of the label, the text of the button, and the background of the label. And pause the video now and try to figure this one out yourself. Let's get started. First of all, I want to create a new class, and this one I called entry. As always, we have to inherit from ttk and frame. Inside of that, we need the dunder init method. In here we need self as always, then we need a parent, then we need 3 more arguments. We need the label, text, we need the button, text, and we need the label background. These 3 arguments we need to cover the second part of the exercise. With that, inside of the init method, don't forget to call the super init method. And then here, you want to add the parent. This entry frame here is going to be this frame, which means inside of it, we can do all of this. As a matter of fact, let me cut out all of this and delete the frame. And instead, I want to paste all of these things in here. Now we have a label, a button, we are placing the label and the button, and then we are packing the frame. Although for this to work, we have to make some changes. First of all, label and button have not the frame as the parent, instead self is the parent now. For the layout, this can stay exactly as it was before. Although for the frame itself, we don't want to pack the frame, we want to pack self. Because remember, self is a frame that we can pack on the parent. With that, we can already create an entry frame in here. The one argument we have to pass in here for now is the self. Although all the other arguments we are not using right now, so let me simply pass in 1, 2, and 3. It doesn't really matter right now. I can run this now, and there we go. We have the very same result. And this is actually super useful because now I can duplicate this entry widget, run this again, and now we have 2 entry fields or frames. I can do this multiple times, and there we go. We have lots of different fields. In my case though, I only want to have 2, but I hope you understand the principle here. Although next up, we have to actually cover these 3 parameters. And they are very easy to work with because all of them are going to be a string. The label text is going to be the text for the label, this one here, which means in there, I want to pass in the label text. The same thing for the button. I don't want to have a string button. Instead, I want to have the button text. Finally, let me add the comma here. For the background, we don't want to have hard-coded red. Instead, we want to have the label background. With that, I now have to pass in proper arguments in here. Let's say for entry 1, I want to have entry 1. Then for the button, I want to have button 1 spelled correctly. And for the background, I want to go with green. Let me duplicate all of these and paste them into the second entry. And let's call this entry 2, button 2, and for the color, let's go with blue. Let's try this again, and there we go. Now we have widgets that work perfectly fine. And now I hope you can see the value of this approach, because this makes it really easy to create lots of widgets that are self-contained. For example, for the entry, we are only having 1 entry here, but this entry contains a huge amount of stuff. If I compare this to the original functional approach, we created the frame here, we created some widgets here, and then we set the layout here. And this was kind of messy because in there we had the second frame and all of this was really hard to follow. Whereas in this approach, we simply have 1 frame that contains it all and we are placing it wherever we need it. And with that, we have the entire app that is much more manageable because now we have logical parts to it that we can work with whenever we need. And this is what you want to use most of the time. As soon as you have any kind of complexity in your app, this approach is vastly superior.